Right after college, I got hired to work as a software developer. I was excited to be starting my first real job, but I was also pretty nervous because I had absolutely no coding skills. I was expected to learn on the job, and I was prepared for that to be intellectually difficult. However, I wasn't prepared for it to be so emotionally difficult. For the first time in my life, I was consistently underperforming. I mean, like really underperforming. And after a while, I started to be afraid to ask questions, because when I did, my coworker would get visibly annoyed, and she'd actually roll her eyes at me. So after months and months of this, I started to doubt whether I could ever become a competent coder. I started to feel anxious and ashamed every time I sat down at my desk to code. So naturally, I did everything I could to avoid coding. I clocked out as early as I could. I even took extra long bathroom breaks just to be away from my desk. In other words, because of my anxieties about coding, I spent less and less time actually learning how to code and more of my time procrastinating or hiding out in the bathroom. So, after months and months of this, I really became, I became really, upset, and eventually I quit. But then after I quit and I started a new job at a different office, something really surprising happened. In this new workplace, the work felt a lot more collaborative. I never once felt stigmatized for not already knowing how to do something. And in a matter of weeks, coding went from being a source of shame and anxiety that I had avoided to being a source of pride and fulfillment that I sought out. I was no longer clocking out early and taking extra long bathroom breaks. Instead, I was glued to my desk and taking extra work home with me. Somehow in this new environment, I had been transformed as a learner, from someone who had fearfully avoided challenges into someone who fearlessly embraced challenges. Now, I don't think my story is unique or even rare. To the contrary, research shows that the environments in which we study and work can have a profound impact on the way we approach learning. On the one hand, they can make us fearfully avoid learning challenges, while on the other hand, they can help us fearlessly embrace learning challenges. Now, researchers have long known about this, but the implications of this research are becoming ever more important because learning is becoming ever more central to professional survival. For example, over the last 30 years, the share of jobs across the US economy that requires post-secondary training has more than doubled. And most economists expect that the importance of learning will only continue to grow with time as more and more jobs are automated out of existence, while many others are changed beyond recognition. So this begs the question, are we preparing our young people for this future? Are our schools inspiring them to fearlessly embrace learning on an unprecedented scale, as clearly they will need to do? Well, the data don't look terribly promising. According to Gallup, whereas 3/4 of grade school students start out being engaged with school, by the time students reach 10th grade, 2/3 of them have become disengaged. 2/3 of them, that's 2.5 million 10th graders who are turning away from learning. Why are so many young people turning away from learning? And what do we need to do differently to help them embrace learning instead? Well, over the last 9 years, I've been a member of a growing community of researchers and educators who are committed to answering this question. We think it's essential to figure out how we need to reshape our schools in order to make sure that young people become fearless learners who embrace learning and are prepared to go into learning-filled careers that challenge and invigorate them. What we're learning, though, is that all too often, our well-intentioned actions as parents or as educators have just the opposite consequence. All too often, we do things that lead students to be afraid of challenging themselves instead of helping them fearlessly embrace a challenge. I'd like to tell you quickly about a study that showed just how this can happen. It's a now famous study from 1998 conducted by Claudia Mueller and Carol Dweck. In their study, the researchers asked 128 fifth graders to complete some logic problems. And after the first round of problems, they asked all the students, or they congratulated all the students on a job well done. They praised them for their performance. But they praised them in importantly different ways. So they praised some students for their effort. They said, "Wow, you did really well. You must have worked hard on those problems." They praised other students for their intelligence. They said, wow, you did really well. You must be smart at those problems. And then the researchers gave all the students an option about whether in a subsequent round of problems, they would rather do some more challenging problems or some easier problems. Well, the kids who had been praised for their effort opted for the harder problems 92% of the time. They weren't afraid to challenge themselves. Those who had been praised for their intelligence only opted for the harder problems 33% of the time. They preferred to avoid the challenge. And it's because for them, those challenging problems were frightening. They carried a risk. After all, if doing well on the easy problems had meant that they were smart, well then what if they struggled? What if they got more of the hard problems wrong? Well then presumably that would mean that they're dumb. In this way, this seemingly benign, this well-intentioned compliment injected fear into an otherwise fun learning situation. It made the students afraid to challenge themselves instead of helping them fearlessly embrace a challenge. Now, when I first learned about this research, it really struck a chord because I recognized that similar fears had gotten in the way of my own learning. The fears of looking dumb had kept me from taking certain hard classes in high school and college. That they had also kept me from asking questions, which without a doubt would have accelerated my learning. And as I reflected on this, it started to dawn on me that there was a tragedy playing out in schools all across the world. That students, millions of students, were turning away from learning, not because they were lazy, not because they were uninterested, but rather because of fears, because they were learning in environments that made them afraid to challenge themselves. Well, this seemed like a really tragic waste of human potential to me. And I felt really compelled to do something about it, but I wasn't sure what. So I packed my bags in Chicago, where I lived at the time, and I headed for Stanford University. At Stanford, I worked with Carol Dweck and Greg Walton. And working with the two of them, I learned a great deal about the factors that empower students to fearlessly embrace learning, as well as about the fears that get in the way of learning. And the more I learned, the more troubled I became. That these profound psychological insights that I was learning as a graduate student were all too often locked away in academic journals, outside the reach of the parents and educators who most needed to know them, who most needed to apply them. So I founded a new center at Stanford called PERTS, the Project for Education Research that Scales. And at PERTS, we work to bridge this gap, to help educators learn and apply these psychological insights so that they can create learning environments that inspire fearless learning rather than fear of learning. Now, we do this in a number of different ways. I'm just going to tell you about two. First, we help educators dispel the harmful myth that intelligence is something fixed about us, that it's something like eye color. And we're doing that because countless studies show that students are more likely to challenge themselves and more likely to learn a lot and do well in school once they understand that their intelligence is actually something they can grow, once they have what researchers call a growth mindset. And with support from philanthropists and from government agencies, we're helping thousands of schools all across the world learn and apply these ideas so that they can foster a growth mindset among their students. We're also helping teachers cultivate secure relationships with and between their students, relationships that help their students feel like they're a valued member of an academic community, feel like they belong. This is critically important because these relationships form the foundation for fearless learning. Learning is an inherently vulnerable act. It's full of mistakes and struggles and missteps. And it's really hard to be vulnerable, to put yourself out there in front of people who you don't trust, in front of people who roll their eyes at your mistakes. Now, I'll be the first to admit that it's a lot of work. It can be really hard to make an environment in which all students feel like they belong, in which all students feel like they can grow. But I'm convinced it's worth the effort because no student should live in fear of learning. I also know it's possible because I've seen firsthand the kind of magic that happens when teachers do this successfully, when they create environments in which students can really learn fearlessly. I'd like to tell you about one educator that does this really well. Her name is Marielle Triggs, and she's a high school math teacher in San Francisco. After each test in Marielle's 9th grade math class, she asked for a volunteer to go up to the front of the room and share a mistake they had made on the previous test with all of their classmates. Imagine your high school math teacher asking for a volunteer to go up to the front of the room and talk about a mistake they had made. When I imagine that, I see a room full of students trying to look as small as possible. invisible ideally, lest their teacher call on them. But in Marielle's class, going up to the overhead is an opportunity that students fight over. They're not afraid to struggle in front of their peers, and it's because Marielle has done two important things. First, she's created an environment of trust and collaboration between her students. And second, she's helped her students internalize the critical lesson that you learn far more by confronting your mistakes than you do by hiding from them. In this way, Marielle is training her students to be fearless learners who can embrace the challenges that tomorrow will bring. We need many more students to be trained in a similar way, because in the coming years, unprecedented numbers of us will need to learn throughout our careers. That can only happen if we help each other transcend the anxieties that keep us from learning, if we reshape our schools and our workplaces so that they inspire fearless learning rather than fear of learning. Now, one of my mentors worked at a school that worked really hard to create a space where all students feel like they belong and feel like they can grow. He asked a new student there, "How is this school different than the school you were in last year?" The student told him, "Everything is different here. At my old school, I felt dumb. People told me I was stupid, and I believed them. Here, I know I can be smart if I try. I know I'm not dumb." Clearly, this school had a profound impact on him. And if you'd like to think about what you can do to have a similar impact, I urge you to start by thinking about the people in your home, in your workplace, in your school, and ask yourself, how can you make a space that makes each of them feel like they belong, feel like they can grow? How can you inspire them to fearlessly embrace learning? Thank you.